April 2021, Forbes publishes its rankings, and for the first time in 16 years, the most valuable football club on the planet is neither Real Madrid nor Manchester United. It's Barcelona. Valuation, $4.76 billion, number one in the world. Just a few weeks earlier, in March 2021, the club's new president sits down to go through the books and discovers the club is effectively bankrupt. Not figuratively, technically. If this were an ordinary company, it would already have been dissolved. By the end of this video, you'll understand how the same club can officially be both the most valuable brand in football and a technical bankrupt. And that's just the beginning of the strangeness. Summer 2017, Barcelona has just sold Neymar to PSG for 222 million euros, a record that still stands today. The board suddenly has a mountain of cash in hand, and that's exactly where the disaster begins. The club buys Ousmane Dembélé for 105 million euros, Philippe Coutinho for 160 million euros. 2 years later, Antoine Griezmann for another 120 million euros. 3 transfers, nearly 400 million euros combined. Not one of them pays off. This wasn't strategy, this was panic, converted into contracts. But it wasn't just the 3 big transfers. At the same time, the board hands out enormous long-term contracts to its core squad. Gerard Piqué, Jordi Alba, Sergio Busquets, Luis Suarez, effectively locking the wage bill in for life. When these players form declines a few years later, the contracts don't go anywhere. The club keeps paying for the past instead of the present. While the team was losing money on transfers, the board was losing its reputation in a different way. In 2020, the Barçagate scandal breaks. It emerges that under President Josep Maria Bartomeu, the club had paid an outside agency, i3 Ventures, to run social media attacks on its own players, including Messi and Piqué, and on journalists who criticized the administration. On October 27, 2020, on the eve of a Champions League match against Juventus, Bartomeu and the entire board resign. A few months earlier, a humiliating 8-2 quarterfinal defeat to Bayern Munich, plus the shock of Messi himself demanding to leave the club. Barcelona isn't an ordinary company with shareholders. It's a club formerly owned by more than 140,000 everyday fan members, the socios. It was them, not investors, who gathered over 20,000 signatures for a vote of no confidence in the president. The empire is collapsing from within, torn down literally by its own owners. And then the pandemic hits. Revenue collapses. The stadium sits empty. Sponsorship deals start cracking. The wage bill, meanwhile, barely shrinks. The club officially closes the 2020-21 season with a 481 million euro loss. On March 1st, 2021, just 6 days before the presidential election, police raid the Camp Nou offices and detain the now former president, Bartomeu, along with 3 former club executives, still over the Barçagate case. On March 7, 2021, Joan Laporta wins the election. He inherits a debt of 1.35 billion euros, 730 million euros of which is due within the year. Club CEO Ferran Reverter will later put it bluntly: the club was technically bankrupt. If it were an ordinary company, it would already have been dissolved. There was no operating cash flow. The club literally couldn't find the cash to pay its own players' wages. Messi's exit fits the same logic. On August 8, 2021, the best player in the club's history says goodbye to Camp Nou in tears. "My family and I were convinced I'd stay here. It's what we all wanted more than anything." He even offered to take a 50% pay cut, from $1.4 million a week down to $700,000. It didn't help. La Liga has enforced a strict salary cap rule since 2013. A club can only spend a set percentage of its revenue on wages. Barcelona was so far over that limit that even a 50% cut didn't solve it. The best player in the club's history was let go to PSG for free, simply because the accounting didn't add up. To survive, Laporta takes out an emergency €500 million loan from Goldman Sachs. But that's not enough. That's when the so-called financial levers begin, a plan people still argue either saved the club or sold off its future. Barcelona sells 25% of its future La Liga TV rights revenue for €667.5 million. It sells 49% of Barça Studios, its media company, for another €200 million. The money doesn't go toward paying down debt. It goes towards simply being able to register new signings like Koundé and Christensen in the summer of 2022. The club was, quite literally, selling off pieces of tomorrow just to play football today. One more item gets added to that list of levers, one that isn't about money, but about symbolism. A shirt sponsor was never taboo for Barcelona. Back in 2011, the club first sold chest sponsor space to Qatar Foundation, then Qatar Airways, then Rakuten. But the stadium itself, Camp Nou, had never carried anyone else's name since it opened in 1957. It was one of the last untouchable things. In 2022, the club signs a deal with Spotify, and for the first time in its history, sells not shirt space, but the name of its own home. The stadium becomes Spotify Camp Nou for the next several years. Barcelona was, quite literally, selling off a piece of the very identity it used to call being more than a club. You'd think the Bartomeu era ended with his resignation in 2020, but in 2023, another case surfaces from that same past. Spanish prosecutors and press uncover that over 17 years, the club paid roughly €7.3 million to a company linked to the former vice president of Spain's referees committee, officially for consulting services. What investigators actually want to know is why a football club spent nearly 2 decades paying the man responsible for assigning referees to La Liga matches. The Negreira case is still under investigation. Barcelona denies it had any influence on results on the pitch, but the payments themselves add one more layer to the same story. A club that for decades spent money in ways that, in hindsight, look less like management and more like a cover-up operation. And while all this was happening, another giant project launches in parallel, the Camp Nou reconstruction, FC Barça. Price tag? €1.45 billion. Another debt stacked on top of the old one. Starting in June 2023, the team moves to play its home games at the Luis Companys Olympic Stadium on Montjuic Hill. The club is, quite literally, living without a home. On November 22, 2025, Barcelona finally returns to the renovated Camp Nou, but not in full. Capacity, just over 45,000, down from the usual 99,000. By March 2026, after a new construction phase gets approved, capacity climbs to 62,652, still less than 2/3 of the final planned 105,000 seats. Full completion has now been pushed back to late 2027. But this story has an unexpected twist on the pitch. Precisely because the club could no longer afford €100 million plus stars like it did in 2017, the coaching staff was forced to trust its own academy graduates en masse. Pedri, Gavi, and later 16-year-old Lamine Yamal broke into the first team not as a bold experiment, but because there was barely any alternative, and it unexpectedly worked. Between 2021 and 2026, the club that was technically bankrupt still collected 8 trophies, 3 La Liga titles, 2 Copa del Rey titles, and 3 Spanish Super Cups. What's missing from that list is the Champions League. The biggest prize still eludes the club, and that too is a cost of the crisis. Plenty of domestic wins, but still not the squad depth for a long European campaign. Bottom line, the club's net debt, on paper, genuinely fell from €680 million in June 2021 to €552 million in June 2023. But at the same time, the club took on a separate debt of nearly €1.5 billion for the FC Barça construction. Counting that stadium debt, the club's total debt load today, by various estimates, isn't 1.35 billion euros anymore. It's somewhere between 2 and 3.5 billion euros, depending on what you count as debt. Officially, the club says the operational crisis is over. But here's what actually happened. Barcelona genuinely paid down part of its old debt and immediately took on a new one, bigger than before, for the stadium. So did they save the club? Or just postpone the next crisis by a few years and hand the bill to whoever's president next? Laporta's Barcelona is a club that learned to be, at the same time, the most expensive brand in football and a technical bankrupt, and doesn't treat that as a contradiction. The very same 2021, when Forbes ranked it #1 in the world, is the very same year its own CEO admitted if this were an ordinary company, it would already have been dissolved. And today, 5 years later, the paradox hasn't gone anywhere. One of the most valuable brands in world football is still finishing its stadium on borrowed money, while the stands sit half empty.